Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to a review that I've wanted to do for some time, but which I kept putting off for reasons which I'll touch on later. It is a system that has been around for a while now, since 2004 in fact, and some count it as one of the first commercial entries in the OSR movement, at least among those that consider it part of the OSR. Apparently, Castles and Crusades was named for Gygax's Castles and Crusades Society, and has gone through several printings of its rulebooks in the years since. Castles and Crusades was created using the D20 OGL back in the day, except refitted to give a feel more aligned with the first edition AD&D era. There are stark differences, of course. It is not by any means a retro clone, and cleaves much closer to modern D20 systems in many ways, while introducing concepts that streamline play and set it apart entirely from both modern and OSR systems. There are three primary books that detail Castles and Crusades core rules, although of those only two are absolutely required. There is the Player's Handbook that covers the core rules, combat rules, spells, classes, races, and equipment. Monsters and Treasure that covers the various monster stats and treasure, including magic items. And then the Castle Keeper's Guide, Castle Keeper being what this game calls its GMs. That gives optional expanded rules with material to assist in creating and running a campaign. This is similar to many D&D based RPGs, except that since the core rules are mostly completely within the Player's Handbook and the treasure and magic items are in the Monster Book, the Castle Keeper's Guide is one of the most optional books of its kind that I've ever seen. I didn't even own it before running Castles and Crusades for the first time. That having been said, it's also incredibly useful without being absolutely required. As a result of this rather unique approach to the core three books, I think I'm going to split this review into two parts, with this one covering the Player's Handbook and the Monsters and Treasure books, which will allow me to cover the Castle Keeper's Guide itself in greater detail separately. There's another bit of an oddity that has me putting off reviewing this over the years. The content of each book has stayed mostly the same since its inception, although additional material has been added in separate books. Reprints of each book have modified layout, made corrections, reimagined the art, all without actually turning it into an entirely new version. At a certain point, additional material and changes were made as well. For instance, the Barbarian class was changed about, and the Illusionist was expanded. The encumbrance system was completely altered as well, at least in its basic format, all without turning it into a Castles and Crusades 2nd edition. So, Castles and Crusades is something of an evolving rule set. The reprints of each book have been staggered as well, such that hardly a year goes by lately without plans for another book to be reprinted. And of late, there's been a tendency to add material from additional books into the main books. As of this recording, the latest release was the 5th printing of the Monsters and Treasure book, which has expanded the base monsters by adding additional monsters and magic items from other books, like the Classic Monsters book and the various culture-specific books. This is great for value and not needing to worry about carrying a bunch of books around, but makes it difficult to cover exactly what's in each one. At this very moment, as I'm recording this, another version of both the Castle Keeper's Guide and the Player's Handbook are in the works, both of which will apparently include additional material. So rather than waiting an indeterminable amount of time as they just cycle through new prints, I will be focusing this review on the system itself as presented in the 7th printing of the Player's Handbook, the 5th printing of the Monsters and Treasure book, and the 2nd printing of the Castle Keeper's Guide, with the understanding that additional printings may include material not covered here. At any rate, we will start with the Player's Handbook. As always, I will take a look at the physical presentation of the book, give a quick rundown of the contents of each chapter of each book, and then give my thoughts on the system as a whole. Available as both a hardback and a PDF, the Player's Handbook sits at just over 190 pages of its current iteration, with a full-color cover and a full-color glossy interior. The binding appears relatively decent in quality and has held up in play for at least my experience, laying flat easily for table reference, although not absolutely flat. The interior layout is 2-column text interspersed with alternating color tables and charts where necessary and sprinkled with both inline and half-page full-color artwork. I will say that I am actually quite fond of the artwork in the version that I'm looking at right now. Something about it just speaks to me. While distinctly high fantasy, it seems a little bit less dungeon punk than the style is nowadays. There is supposed to be new art in the upcoming version, so we'll have to see if it holds that classic vibe or not. In terms of overall organization, the Player's Handbook has 8 major sections. introductory material, character creation rules, the various classes, the various races, miscellaneous character completion, odds and ends, an equipment section, magical spells for those spellcasting classes, then a section of the actual rules of play in the Castle Keepers section. The intro section starts with your typical introduction to role-playing games, but also to the specific feel of Castles and Crusades in general, and the rules-like philosophy in particular. There's some guidance on the materials needed, pretty standard for tabletop role-playing games, with the usual array of polyhedral dice necessary. Finally, it concludes on the importance of having fun within the rules. As far as creating a new character goes, it goes over the basic steps, imagining what you wish to play, rolling the attributes, picking a class, then a race, and then fleshing out the character overall. It goes into each step in turn. As far as attributes go, Castles and Crusades uses your standard 6: Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma. The standard method in the book is to roll 3d6 and then assign as you wish. The attribute bonuses use a moderate old-school bonus range of -3 to +3 over a pretty standard bell curve. Which, if you're wondering why I go into that, as some have had that question, there are at least 3 main bonus distributions I've seen in OSR games and D20-based games in general. The 0E one that really only has a +1 or +2 max. The 3-point bell distribution is similar to the one used here that gives a broad average stat range with bonuses and penalties somewhat rare. And then a 3rd edition style linear bonus that increases 1 over every 2 stat points from -4 to +4, with each step, just being pretty linear along this bonus. This makes for a significant difference in the rarity of both bonuses and penalties if you're using randomized attribute points over a point-buy system, and can distinctly impact play in subtle ways. I can't really believe that I have to describe the difference between these systems, but I get asked over and over again whenever I say, it just uses, the standard bonus -3 to +3, and it gets kind of old explaining it. So here it goes. I've explained it. Anyway, back to Castles and Crusades itself. The Siege system, which is the core of Castles and Crusades, uses something called primary and secondary attributes. For characters, they can select 2 or 3 if they're human primary attributes. Of these primary attributes, 1 is the player's choice, and 1 is determined by the class. This affects the challenge class or the difficulty of attribute checks, which are the primary way of resolving non-combat actions in Castles and Crusades. I will go more into the basic attribute check mechanic later, but it generally follows the 3rd edition method of d20 plus mods against a challenge number. The next section covers the classes, and there are 13 in the current iteration, although more are available in supplements that may be added to the next version of the Player's Handbook. There's the Assassin, the Barbarian, the Bard, the Cleric, the Druid, the Fighter, the Illusionist, the Knight, the Monk, the Paladin, the Ranger, the Rogue, and the Wizard. Each class has an associated prime attribute, an extensive description of the class and its abilities, and then an entry that shows the prime attribute associated with the class, the hit die type that they roll for hit points each level, any alignment restrictions the class may have, weapons and armor restrictions, a summary of their ability names, and then a table that shows the experience point progression for each level of 1 to 12, as well as hit die and base to hit progression. Technically speaking, each character class only goes up to level 12 in the Player's Handbook, but offers a formula to get additional levels from 13 and above. Additional abilities aren't really gained in the Player's Handbook at those levels, although there are alternate rules for additional abilities to be found in the Castle Keeper's Guide. As for each class, in general they follow the same sort of theme as their AD&D style progenitors, but there are a few critical differences. Assassins combine stealth and disguise with a sneak attack and death attack. Barbarians, rather than having a berserk ability, have more durability and wilderness-based abilities that help with their various non-combat tasks, although they do get a built-in whirlwind attack and the ability to summon other barbarians later. The Bard gets an array of utility abilities, including the classic legend lore, but also the ability to inspire combat bonuses in the party. Unlike in many games, they do not get spellcasting, and this is a common theme in Castles and Crusades. The hybrid classes that you see in AD&D do not get any spellcasting in this system. There is a Cleric, which is a pretty standard blunt weapon using heavy armor caster, who gets Cleric spells and the Turn Undead ability. Turn Undead is somewhat simplified in Castles and Crusades compared to old school style games. The Druid is another caster, and you get a number of woodland-based lore and shape-changing abilities with it. Somewhat similar to old-school versions of the Druid, but with slightly less in the way of special abilities in order to balance it out. The Fighter is your basic, well, warrior type. They get weapon specialization ability and the potential for extra attacks, either against below 1 hit die enemy or just in general at a much higher level. The Illusionist is similar to the magic user-derived class from earlier edition RPGs, but has additional bonuses to save versus illusion and the ability to disguise themselves further. I'll go into this later, but they also get healing spells on their list. The Knight is similar to the Cavalier, able to wear any armor and wield most weapons, provided their code of conduct allows it, as well as starting with a mount. They get horsemanship abilities as well as charisma-based abilities to inspire allies and demoralize enemies in the field of combat. They don't have to be of any particular alignment, but each has a code of conduct that they must fight, which they can go ahead and work out with a castle keeper. Monks get a number of special abilities based on martial arts, lore, and movies, as well as any additional movement and armor class bonuses that you'd expect from them from other RPGs. The Paladin, again, doesn't get spells, but otherwise gets a smattering of special abilities, from curing disease and healing people to turning undead and providing bonuses against evil creatures. Rangers get a number of special abilities that help them stealth through the wild, but are less effective in civilized areas. They also get the ability to track, as well as a favored enemy that increases their combat abilities against that enemy type. Again, they get no spells. The Rogue gets your pretty typical thief skills, as well as the back attack and sneak attack abilities, basically doing slightly more damage when they get the drop on an opponent, then even more if they can get the drop on an opponent and attack them from the rear. Finally, the Wizard is your very basic magic user type, having spell books and casting wizard spells as their main and basically only ability. The races section covers the standard races in Castles and Crusades. They are typical of the genre. You have your human, your dwarf, your elf, your gnome, your half-orc, your half-elf, and your halfling. Each one has a description, a general guide to typical personalities and affinities with other races, what sorts of environments that they live in, and then a list of their racial traits and abilities. This is followed by a summary of what languages that they generally speak, their size, movement rate, typical classes that they take, attribute modifiers, and then any special ability modifiers for particular classes, typically the skill-based classes such as Ranger, Rogue, and Assassin. These are pretty standard for the generic fantasy races that you've come to likely learn and love throughout the genre. Dwarves are small and tough, elves are quick, half-orcs are strong and ugly. It should be noted, however, that the typical classes don't actually limit what class you can pick by default, although they do give the castle keeper the option to do that. So in the basic core rules, you can be any race with any class. The completing the character section is the usual odds and ends, the character's personality and so forth, but also their alignment. Castles and Crusades uses the classic 2-axis law chaos alignment and the good-evil alignment system. The character creation section finishes up with things like choosing a deity and a name. The equipment section follows with starting coin values for new characters and then charts of equipment. The default Castles and Crusades coinage system uses a 1 plat equals 10 gold equals 100 silver equals 1,000 copper style system. It's slightly more modern than the old school systems of variable value, but easier for calculations, especially for people that grew up with, decimal-based coinage systems. Each piece of equipment has a name, a cost, an AC value if necessary, damage and range values if necessary, weight, but also an encumbrance value if you're using the simplified encumbrance system. Anything such as whether a weapon must be used two-handed and any other special abilities are noted below the charts in a little kind of footnote area. There's a fairly large amount of piecemeal armor as well for those who want to mix and match their outfits. The simplified encumbrance system simply assigns an overall encumbrance rating to a character based on their strength score, modified by either their strength or constitution, or both if they're prime attributes. Encumbrance value is then added up, with some containers able to carry a few EV worth of gear for free, as it were, and then that is compared to their overall encumbrance rating to see if they're encumbered or not, and by how much. It's a somewhat more abstract system than the true weight-based systems that you might have seen in other RPGs, but it doesn't go completely abstract as you might see in some rules light systems. I actually really like this for streamlined encumbrance tracking, since I'm kind of a stickler for that in many of my games. The equipment chapter does conclude with a quick examination of expert weapons and armor, basically masterwork versions that provide some minor non-magical bonuses for exorbitant costs. The magic section follows. Castles and Crusades uses a standard old-school memorization system in which spellcasting characters prepare spells into slots. Clerics and Druids have access to all of their classes' spells in a particular level, while Wizards and Illusionists use spellbooks and can learn them from other spellbooks, research, or scrolls. Casting spells requires concentration and can be interrupted and disrupted during combat. Saving throw challenge level for spells are set by the caster's level, and there is a spell resistance that is overcome by a d20 check for those characters that have it. Spells use a sort of abstracted system of components as well, based on like the 3rd edition type system. Verbal, somatic, material, and then focus/divine focus, which is very similar, as I said, to most d20 systems out there now. Spells range from level 0 to level 9, with level 0 spells, cantrips, and orisons following the 3rd edition standard of being expended when cast, just like the higher level spells. The spell charts list each spell by level with a summary of their effects, and then the page number where one can find the more in-depth description. The in-depth descriptions are moderately fleshed out, with a name, level, and class, casting time, range, duration, saving throw, whether the spell resistance applies, and then components necessary, followed by a more in-depth description of the spell's exact effects. These tend toward the simple in terms of descriptions for the most part, and among some new spells, there's a number of classic D&D type spells as well, although some may have their names changed. A few are changed in other critical ways, however, and in terms of overall power level or level of effectiveness, most tend towards a more 3rd edition style balance than OSR balance. For those of you who have spent a lot of time playing casters in a number of editions, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. In terms of the spells themselves, they are a good mix. They have some decent new ones as well as some classic ones in there. For the most part, each class's spell list is what you would expect, except that the Illusionist does have its list expanded, not only raising it to 9th level, but including a number of healing and curative spells, albeit higher levels than the Cleric counterparts. This means that both Illusionists and Druids can fill in somewhat as secondary healers, although Druids may have a better time of it. And this does make up for the lack of the hybrid casters, which usually serve that purpose in these sorts of games. After the magic section, there is the last section, the Castle Keeper and the game. This is the section covering the more in-depth core rules of the system and is meant for the Castle Keeper's eyes. It goes over some basic advice regarding the mood of play, maintaining the pace of the game, dealing with different scales of play, extended campaigns versus one-off adventures, how to handle the game over multiple levels, and so forth. The section then goes on in how to design adventures, and then the sorts of encounters to consider, how to balance them, combat versus non-combat puzzles, dealing with NPCs and the like. It's all very general material that is useful for a new GM or Castle Keeper, including when to use or not use the rules. Very little in terms of actual rules are given in this section until you reach the attributes and the game header. This is where the core mechanics of the siege engine are described in more specifics. Attribute checks, which are used for almost all non-trivial, non-combat resolution, involve a d20 roll plus the character's level plus their attribute modifier, then compared to a challenge class. The challenge class starts with the challenge base, which is based on whether the attribute in question is primary or secondary, then is modified by the challenge level, which is basically the level of difficulty of a particular action. This total results in the challenge class overall. If the attribute check meets or exceeds the challenge class, then the action was a success. Otherwise, it was a failure. It's very much a simplified version of the d20 rules core mechanic from other systems. Saving throws are much the same, an attribute check, but with the challenge class calculations in which attribute check determined by the effect class, the hit dice, or the level of the originator, etc. In this way, it sort of heralds the 5th edition way of doing things, because these saves are all based on the actual attributes and not categories. Combat rules follow and are pretty simple. It uses a d10 for initiative rolled at the start of each round and a d20 plus appropriate mods versus AC to determine attacks. Pretty standard d20 stuff. There's rules for surprise and then the actions a character can take during combat. They're abstracted, similar to old school systems, with characters able to attack, cast a spell, move, use an ability, or use an item. If they attack, they can move up to half their movement rate, but can't move and cast spells. Ability use may or may not include movement, but that's up to the Castle Keeper based on the particular circumstances. There are rules for non-lethal actions and multiple actions, more in-depth guidance on movement in combat, and so forth, including the charge attack, and explanations of melee and range combat. There's rules for unarmed combat, rules for grappling, etc., etc. It's all very simple compared to grappling rules I've seen in other systems, with various situation modifiers that can arise in combat included as well. There's an explanation of armor class and its components, a quick look at cover, magic, and other combat situations, then descriptions of various combat maneuvers beyond the basic attack. Hit point rules follow, and while Castles and Crusades follows 3rd edition methods in terms of actual hit point accrual per level, natural healing is discussed here, and actually starts slow and requires complete bed rest, but then speeds up after 7 and then 14 days of this sort of care. In terms of 0 and negative hit points, the effects are somewhat more debilitating, and yet at the same time less deadly. At 0 hit points or above, magical healing works normally, and then it starts to work less and less the more into the negatives you go, until finally you just outright die. This healing and death system seems pretty well balanced to me. It does take some of the more immediate threat of death off of characters, especially relatively low-level ones, while still providing for some consequences if a character hits the negative hit points, so you don't get this comical situation I get in my 5th edition games all the time, where characters constantly popping up and down like jack-in-the-boxes. This can make for some dramatic rescues in close scenarios, and I really kind of like it. At any rate, after the healing and hit points section, there is description of various sorts of damage, including falling and subdual damage, rules for turning undead, and then quick descriptions of experience points and gaining levels, which are pretty straightforward. There is an option to provide experience for treasure gain, but this is, of course, optional. There's talk of various treasure types, and then movement, spell resistance, language, and then vision types, which are useful to know. A quick explanation of time follows when we finally learn that Castles and Crusades rounds are just the 10-second version rather than the more old-school 1-minute version. An appendix of optional rules follows, which basically gives some optional rules for multiclassing, which is not included in the base rules, which is surprising considering how old school it is. And there's a class and a half system as well, which allows you to add some elements of a class to another class without going full multiclass. The book rounds out with the OGL legal page and the character sheet. So you see, in the Castles Crusades Player's Handbook, there's basically everything you need to play the game except for the monster stats and the treasure itself. And those are covered in the Monsters and Treasure book, which I'll quickly look at before addressing the system as a whole. Although it is certainly a much larger book, it is also mostly just a bestiary and magical item compendium, so I will go through it relatively quickly. The 5th printing of the Monsters and Treasure book, like the Player's Handbook, is available in both hardcover and PDF. The hardcover has a full-color cover and just about 370 pages of glossy full-color interior pages, with the same general 2-column format as the first one, interspersed with inline and half-page full-color illustrations. Monsters and Treasure only has a few main sections. There is introductory material, and then the monster list itself, which encompasses the bulk of the book. Towards the end, there's the brief set of rules for generating treasure, as well as the magic item descriptions themselves. The book wraps up with a pair of appendices, one dealing with experience awards and the next dealing with poisons. The introductory material itself starts with a brief examination of the book, and then a brief section on what monsters are and how to play them. There's some basic combat rules telling you how to derive a monster's base attack roll modifier, as well as how to deal with saves for monsters. Monsters, instead of picking individual attributes as secondary or primary, merely treat all physical or all mental attributes as primary or secondary, or, in some cases both, as listed per monster. Monster characteristics are then explained. Each monster entry has a number encountered, the size of the creature, then the creature's hit dice, as well as what type it is. This is followed by the monster's movement, their armor class, then their basic attacks and damage. Specials follow, which may include a number of special abilities, defenses, and sense types. Saves come after that, detailing what characters are their primary, physical, mental, both, or none, and with other attributes being considered secondary if they're not listed. The monster's intelligence follows so that you know how to play their approach to situations, and then alignment and monster type are listed as well. The stat block finishes with the treasure type and then experience point value, which has both a flat total and a per hit point total. Basically, not all monsters of the same hit dice are alike, and in fact, not all monsters of the same type are alike. If a particular goblin has more hit points than the others in his group, it is worth slightly more than the others in terms of experience. After this examination of the monster stats, a table on how to determine the experience value is listed in the introduction, then guidance on making monsters themselves. The actual monster list follows and comprises the vast majority of this book, and includes the stat block that I just went over, as well as the description of that monster and guides for their tactics and combat. Descriptions of any special abilities are listed here as well. Many monsters, but not all of them, have color illustrations to show what they look like. In prior releases of Monsters and Treasure, the number of monsters was extremely basic, but with the 5th printing it has been dramatically expanded, including monsters from a number of expansions, such as the classic Monsters and Treasure book that incorporated some tabletop favorites from years gone by, and various cultural books that give monsters from myth and lore their due. As a result, the number of monsters covered in the 5th printing is rather extensive and can more readily flesh out a campaign, especially if you're looking for one of a particular, cultural basis. I will say that the incorporation of monsters from myth and lore means that some monster types are a little bit overrepresented, and a few may have multiple versions. For instance, if a creature has been heavily genericized over time in fantasy role-playing games, but is also mentioned in a cultural book, it may have a version representing the generic fantasy trope, as well as the actual myth and legend one. There is a distinct lack of many demons and fiends. The basic Castles and Crusades books always seem to only mention a few, and concentrate more on mythical creatures, which is a genre choice that I can respect. The Tome of the Unclean, available separately, covers a decent number of demons, devils, and other fiends if you want them for your game. After the monster list, some 312 pages in total, we finally get to the treasure section. The treasure section begins with an introduction to treasure and covers more than just standard coins. There's also consideration for art items and jewelry, unworked precious metals and stones, as well as land, titles, and services, an often overlooked part of wealth in role-playing games. This is followed by a quick examination of the basic principles of each, and then details on magical item creation. Magic item creation is a more undefined process in Castles and Crusades versus the 3rd edition rules, reflecting a more old-school feel. It also requires fairly high level, especially considering that low-level range of Castles and Crusades style characters overall. Scrolls and potions, for instance, can be created starting at 7th level. Others require a little bit higher level. There are some rules for the costs involved, as well as some basic examples of special materials that you can make them from. There's even rules for destroying magic items, since they are tougher than normal items but not invulnerable. Rules for sentient items follow, which are comparable to the intelligent weapon rules from old editions. However, it is no longer limited to just weapons. Any item can be sentient. I would just hate to be one of the sentient special items that is something like a bag of holding. That would kind of suck, wouldn't it? Anyway, guidelines for appropriate land and title rewards follow, with lists for each class. This is intentionally left kind of vague, since it will vary from campaign to campaign. Some examples of services as treasure follow as well, warriors swearing their swords to the party or townsfolk offering repair work and the like. Guidance on how and when to award treasure follow, which can be useful for some folk, and then there's the treasure tables themselves. Castles and Crusades uses a treasure type system wherein each treasure type, 1 to 18, has a % chance to have coins of a particular value, gems, extraordinary items such as artwork and jewelry, and then magic items. This is similar to certain other old school games. This is followed by individual tables for the various sorts of items that you can potentially get, mundane or magical. After the tables are descriptions of magical treasure. There's the usual run of potions, scrolls, weapons, armor, miscellaneous items, etc. It should be noted that even with the additional items from the expansions, such as classic Monsters and Treasure, the item list in Castles and Crusades is a little bit smaller than most modern-style games. Oh, there's plenty of variety, but for instance, there's somewhat less in terms of different potions, less different wands, and so forth. A number of items that appear in the tables just aren't described. For the most part, these are self-explanatory and simply duplicate whatever spell they are named at. For instance, most of the potions are simply potions of a particular spell, same with scrolls, leaving description space for more unique options. This is especially prevalent in the scrolls and potions I just mentioned. There is some classic magic items within the list. The classic 9-life Stealer, the Vorpal Sword, the Holy Avenger, Bag of Tricks, Bag of Holding, figurines of wondrous power, and so forth. But there's also some unique and new items, for instance, Horn of the Moorfolk that can be used to summon sea creatures, or the Sylvan Blade that deals extra damage in the woodlands. There's items from myth as well, from the Club of Dagda from Celtic myth, Dragon's Teeth from Greek myth that can be planted to spawn fighters that fight for you, and so forth. There's also a fair mix of cursed items, including some classics such as the Berserking Sword and the Vacuous Grimoire. There are a mix of artifacts included as well. The artifacts especially seem to benefit from the inclusion of various cultural supplements, including things like the Aegis of Zeus, the Caduceus of the Staff of Hermes, and Excalibur, the Sword of Arthur, among the more classic artifacts such as the Deck of Many Things and the Hammer of Thunderbolt. This helps make up for the loss of some IP-specific items. The Monsters and Treasure book closes out with 2 appendices, awarding experience, mostly just briefly touches on the same sorts of experience award guidelines from the main player's handbook, and then the Poison appendix, which is used to give a poison list and tell you how to come up with more of them. The poison list is relatively small, even compared to some classic RPGs, but is well-rounded and suitable for expansion. As a reminder, I will take a look at the Castle Keeper's Guide in a follow-up video, but these 2 books basically give you what you need to play a campaign in Castles and Crusades. So, what do I think of them and the core Castles and Crusades rules? Well, in terms of presentation, I think that these books are excellent. I enjoy the quality of the core books in this iteration, although having owned a few of the older books as well as the Tome of the Unclean, I can say that this look and feel doesn't necessarily extend to other products. The artwork is very nice, having its own more classic style that, while less gritty than, say, those of mid to early TSR era offerings, definitely lacks the oddities present in modern RPG art. No weird glowing gems and little in the way of massive unnecessary pauldrons, for instance. Oh, it has its touch of the fanciful and fan service alike, especially the latter, but it feels more classically fantasy than what you would expect to see in a video game. The entries and rules are relatively easy to read and follow, and the core system, while a modification of the core D20 system from the 3rd edition era, has some surprisingly modern touches to it and walks a fair balance between old-school simplicity and modern ease of use. The fact that the system is an evolving one with no hard breaks between versions, save for additions between each printing, can be a little bit troublesome, unless you ensure that your entire group is on the same printing of the books. Fortunately, new additions and replacements are generally easy enough to implement into a game if you play it long enough for that to become an issue. The only real problem I had with that approach is in writing a review like this, since it is a bit of a moving target. A slow-moving one, granted, but moving nonetheless. The other issues that I have is the editing in Castles and Crusades tends to be hit or miss. Looking through old versions of the books, there's issues that crop up in tables and write-ups from time to time, a few of which may obscure particular entries. They don't generally impact the main rules, but are generally easy to correct for, but they are noticeable. So why do I have an issue with them? Simply because some of these errors tend to pop up in printing after printing long after they should have been corrected, and they may stick around for a while. While both the Player's Handbook and the Monsters and Treasures have been through enough iterations that most of these issues have been caught over the years, a few linger and they can become increasingly obvious in other books with fewer iterations, such as the Castle Keeper's Guide, or absolutely new ones, such as the Tome of the Unclean. Including expansion material into the core books is a really nice concept, and one that can limit the number of additional resources that you need to purchase or carry around, but it can exacerbate the editing issues. Furthermore, the different approaches to a few entries, especially regarding monsters and items, can provide a few inconsistencies in terms of what to expect from creatures. It is a minor quibble, I will admit it is a minor quibble, but it is noticeable from time to time. As for the system itself, I already mentioned that it skirts the boundary between old and modern systems. I will say, as per my experiences, it runs as fast as most OSR-style games that I've played, although it does take a little bit of getting used to since there are a few differences. There are some rules in Castles and Crusades that eventually made their way into more modern systems one way or another, and those rules are actually fairly decent, as justified by the fact that they were adapted. The saving throw system, for instance, can be more straightforward than trying to figure out whether to use a wands or breath weapon save for something that might be either in an OSR system, and allow for more in-depth use than the 3-save system from 3rd edition. The math is simple to grasp, and the encumbrance system, as I mentioned, allows for a good, quick, easy way to abstractly handle encumbrance without necessarily removing its impact from the game. The way that it handles the classes makes it feel like more than a simple retro clone. Individually, the classes feel like old-school classes without being exact duplicates, meaning that it can feel just like another classic D&D romp or not, depending on the group selection. Magic seems to be a little bit toned down in terms of top-end power from typical OSR games, and its limitation to purely magic-using classes does shift the focus a bit onto more mundane characters, which is great if you're looking for a more gritty feel to your game or a sword and sorcery style feel. But at the same time, it doesn't nerf the casters completely, which is good, because I am tired of modern systems doing that. The existence of healing spells on both the Druid and the Illusionist spell list does offer some secondary healer relief, as I mentioned earlier, enough that the group doesn't have to include a Cleric, and the Bard and Knight's abilities to rally their party members can be very useful in a larger group. Aside from a few of the more unique entries into the magic item list, it's much the same as you could expect from any D&D or D20 derived fantasy game, and even the new translations of classic myth and legend based magic items and artifacts are on par with what already exists. The monsters kind of walk the line between old and new and suit the rules very well. It is a bit harder to directly translate between, say, a 2nd or 3rd edition monster and a Castles and Crusades monster. Even the stats seem fairly similar, especially since Castles and Crusades uses a more old-school scaling system in terms of some things. Attack bonuses and damage, hit points, hit dice stop accruing after a certain level, for instance, switching to flat bonuses like you saw in 1st and 2nd edition. It shifts the overall scale of the game towards the low to middling level and using the core rules, and that's actually something I enjoy. There are some solid concepts in Castles and Crusades that make it stand out on its own and really go a long way towards making it feel like your standard fantasy romp without being a direct clone. This can be very good if you're looking for variety, but if you've got a group that already plays a lot of a particular system, it can be somewhat hard to convince them to switch to Castles and Crusades over something that more directly mimics a style of game that they are actively invested in. Or at least that's been my experience with it, which I think is a bit of a shame, but not one that can be it's not going to completely bar you from doing it. Castles and Crusades, after all, is relatively easy to learn. It does have a lot going for it. It's available on various virtual tabletops as well, which can make remote play easier, especially in this day and era. Although there may be older versions of the books on those virtual tabletops. The consolidation of the various expansions into the 3 main books, the Player's Handbook, the Monsters and Treasure, and the Castle Keeper's Guide, means that eventually the cost to enter is going to be somewhat lower than some tabletop games, at least if you want a lot of the additional rules, although nowhere near the free ones. And the fact that it's been around since the early 2000s means that there's a fair amount of material produced for it, both in terms of supplements and adventures, and even some third-party stuff. In summary, it is an excellent system that mimics old-school gaming while being just different enough to be its own thing. I look forward to seeing where Troll Lore Games goes with this, especially with the revised Player's Handbook and Castle Keeper's Guide coming out. I do recommend it to people who are looking for something both familiar and yet different at the same time. And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up here. I will put links to where you can pick it up below. And keep an eye out for my Castles and Crusades Castle Keeper's Guide video. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.